All right, my friends, we are back. Part two of discussing room equalization, whether it's good or bad for good sound. We got Matthew Pose here. Thanks for coming back, Matt.
Yeah, thanks. Hopefully we didn't lose everybody when they come back.
Yeah, well, they can watch it on the replay.
That's
So,
true.
so the first part of this discussion, we defined what room EQ is. You took the measurements of speakers and then you simulated the response into a room EQ simulator to show the effects of how it would change the response of those speakers in a typical room. In this part, we're actually going to take measurements inside before and after to show what's going on with room EQ to a real speaker to see if it matches the theoretical and to see if it's actually doing anything beneficial or if it's being detrimental to the sound.
Exactly. And I saw somebody ask a question in the last presentation that we were doing about did I take the speaker outside or just into another room? So outside. So what we did was we took the equivalent of anechoic measurements. We took the speaker outside into free space so that there were no reflections around it and measured the speaker. That's how we measure all of our speakers when we provide our spinorama data. And I used that data to do the original simulation. I also used that data when I did the in-room measurement in EQ here. And I'll explain how I did that, but those measurements were really critical to being able to show what was truly going on in terms of what the EQ was doing to the sound you hear rather than the sound you measure with a microphone and see.
Okay, so let me share my screen and we'll get the slideshow going again. And guys, don't forget we have a super chat feature. If you really want something to stand out and you want us to answer it, I will happily do that. So here we are. Why did you choose this Martin Logan speaker? And it's a good question. I'd like you maybe to give a 30-second intro about why.
Well, we love Martin Logan, so I don't want to say anything too negative here. There was no nefarious reason for it. It was nothing more than this is a speaker that I was supposed to do a video for you on, and so it's been sitting here waiting to go back to Martin Logan. And I needed a speaker that we had reviewed, we had measured it outside, and that I physically had it here. And this just happened to be one where we reviewed it already, we had measurements for it, and I happened to have it in my listening room.
So guys, you heard it directly from Matt. He committed to doing a video review on YouTube. So Matt, you now have to do it because you admitted it to an audience of over 100,000 followers.
Yes, I do need to do that. So, but we can jump into it. So here, using Odyssey and a multi-point measurement, what you can see, this was 5 spatially average measurements. The response of that speaker in my room, that is the actual response. That is not a simulation. That is the actual response of the speaker with and without EQ. So you can see with EQ, using this measurement technique, it's very flat, right? It did a really good job correcting it. It looks a million times better. And so from this standpoint alone, it certainly looks like EQ, Odyssey in this case, fixed things, right?
Yeah, it looks great, actually.
Yeah. Now, some of you may be asking why I didn't use Dirac, and I'll just mention that was the original plan, but in order to do it, I had to use the computer software, which has been upgraded, and I was having problems with my version of it. So in order to make it feasible to actually move forward with this project, I decided to stick with Odyssey, but we can always revisit this again with the other EQ system. In fact, we plan to do that.
Yeah, there's a lot of Odyssey uses because many of our viewers have Denon receivers or they have Onkios, older Onkios that have Odyssey.
Right. And I'll mention, too, that everything I'm showing you is true of all EQ systems. This is not the first time I've done it. It's just the first time I've done it in a way that I could display it for everybody. So here's what you hear. This is the listening window, and this is with EQ and without EQ. So the top one is the listening window without any EQ, and the bottom one is the listening window with EQ.
So what's interesting right off the bat is I hear people all the time on the forums when they run Odyssey, a lot of them complain that the bass is too thin. And I'm wondering, just looking at that big null it created, I know it's upper bass, but that could, and there's 2 nulls actually. There's a null at around 80 hertz, and then there's a huge null at 100 to about 150 hertz. There's a lot of impact at those frequencies that we're now losing.
Could be. I mean, the other thing to keep in mind is that it's hard to say at those frequencies how much of that you would hear versus the room. That's probably mostly like room sound, and that was corrections specifically to room modes that were above 100 hertz. So it's possible that what you see there is a little bit unrealistic. Probably to have done this, and again, I think we're going to do an article to go along with this. you would need to splice in the spatially average measurement that I did before, probably below 200 hertz. So I would ignore that stuff for now, because you could be right, but it's hard to say. That's kind of in the transition zone I was talking about.
Mm-hmm.
I would more look at everything above 200 hertz for errors. And in this case, I would actually say it appears that it thickened the sound a bit in the kind of upper bass, lower mid-range area between, let's say, 200 hertz.
2 to 500, yeah.
Yeah, and then it introduced a bit of a dip. I'm not sure why. And then the crossover region actually became significantly more pronounced, and the high frequencies became less flat.
I could tell you why the crossover region got worse. There's a 2 kilohertz compensation on Odyssey you could turn on or off. And I'm wondering if your system had it turned on.
Probably. To be honest, I just ran it the way I usually do.
That's by default. That's by default. Yeah.
Yeah. So if we go to the next one, I've got a little bit of explanation added in. So here you can see the upper bass is made worse. Like I said, I don't know for sure below 200 hertz how audible that stuff would be, but there is something going on right around 200 hertz that may not be really ideal. Obviously, in that middle region, there's a big dip that was introduced. The crossover region is a very significant dip. And then in general, the treble is not as smooth as it was. So what you can see is that really, really flat response is not reflective of what you actually hear. So I see somebody's asking what I mean by listening window. So the listening window refers to a set of angles on axis out over, I think it's like 20, maybe 25 degrees, that constitutes the portion of the speaker's dispersion that you hear in a room. It's the direct sound from the speaker. As I said, when you measure I said this in the last video, but I should restate it here. When you measure in a room with an omnidirectional microphone, that microphone is picking up the direct sound of the speaker, but it's also picking up reflections from all over the room. And the measurement can't get rid of those. So a spatially average measurement is basically taking all of that direct sound and all those reflections that I mentioned and averaging those all together. And that's what created that really flat response with the EQ applied. The listening window is taking that and looking only at the portion of the measurements that are the direct sound that you hear. And this is based on the fact that the brain is capable of filtering out those reflections. But the microphone and the FFT filter system the FFT measurement system that I'm using cannot do that. So, so I see somebody's also mentioning direct. We will do that, but I will say that there really isn't a major difference. It'll do the same thing.
Okay.
Okay, I know a lot of you are going to say, I've used these different systems before, and my ears don't lie, it must sound better. Well, actually, there's a number of reasons why people often think these EQ systems are making things better. Now, I don't want to completely discount it. One of the things that all of the better EQ systems I've used tend to do is they do tend to improve the bass. So Dirac especially does a really good job in the bass. Odyssey does a pretty good job in the bass. And some of the other ones have done a decent job improving the bass as well. I mean, I've had mixed results with YPAO or whatever.
YPAO never improves the bass in my experience.
Right. I've had mixed results. I had one scenario where it clearly made it better in the bass, like below 100 hertz, but it made everything else worse. So anyway, the point is, it's not uncommon for these EQ systems to make an improvement in the bass, and you can't discount how much that matters. Bass can account for anywhere from 30 to 50% of our overall perception of sound, our enjoyment of a system, how well balanced it sounds, how good it sounds, how clear it sounds. A lot of that is anchored in the bass itself. So when you smooth the bass out, that makes a really big difference. And it's been shown before that when you improve the bass, we perceive other aspects of the sound as having been improved too. So when the bass is better, all of a sudden the treble is clearer, the mid-range is clearer, the speaker is more neutral and natural. Like everything sounds better, even though the only thing you touched was the bass. So auto EQ fixes bass, and that's one reason why people tend to think it sounds better. EQ can make beneficial improvements in the mid and high frequencies. It's not a total disaster. So again, I like Dirac. I've used it for many years. I've been a tester of it, and it can make improvements. And so I don't want to completely say that it doesn't make speakers better. What I'm saying is it can make speakers worse and far more readily than people realize. So there is the possibility that it sounds better because it is better. But there's two other things to keep in mind here. There's also an expectation bias, meaning that we start to look for differences because we expect it to be better, and then we hear what we're looking for.
That's how the cable industry thrives.
Well, and then they go on a whole nother level, which is placebo. And so the placebo effect is that We think it's going to sound better, and so it does. And all of these are psychological. They're not reality. The other thing that you mentioned is that we tend to hear things that are louder is better. And it's not uncommon for the levels not to be matched between the EQ'd and uneq'd version. Now, you mentioned Odyssey tends to make it louder when it's on versus off. And I think you know more about that than I do.
Oh yeah, when I first tested Odyssey on the Denon AVR 5805, this is the like 2005 era or even before that, when Odyssey XT came out. I measured before and after, and it was on average 3 or 4 dB louder with Odyssey turned on. And I sent this to Denon to show them, and they actually had to go and change the firmware to bring it down because it was ridiculous. It was night and day difference when you turned it on and off. And then I still caught receiver manufacturers implementing Odyssey where the level clearly went up at least 1.5 dB with it turned on. So 1.5 dB is enough for someone to prefer the louder sound over the lower sound.
For sure. So the bigger point we're making here is that it is not uncommon for things that actually measure worse to sound better simply because they're louder, we think they're going to, or we're looking for certain things. And so, that's a problem. Now, a lot of you are already talking about Dirac and Odyssey, and I just want to kind of talk about my own experience so you understand where I'm coming from with this. So I was a beta tester of the original version of Dirac. I was also a beta tester of their new version of Dirac. And so I've been using Dirac now basically since its inception. Odyssey I've been using not necessarily since its introduction, but since the introduction specifically of XT Pro on Onkyo devices. And so I have an Onkyo receiver that has it, and I have used it in a few other forms, but that was the main version that I had gotten most used to using. And then I've been using manual PEQ for probably at least 20 years to correct bass. That was something that's been well known for a long time to be effective. And then I also had gotten into designing FIR corrections for room acoustics and have been doing that for about 15 years. And as I mentioned, Dirac and Odyssey are both based on FIR. It's a little more complex than some of the stuff I was doing, but the point is, these are systems that I understand very well. I've been using them for a very long time. I actually had worked with Dirac and NAD at one point to help set up some systems at when the NAD receivers were first introduced, and we're using Dirac. I was helping to set it up because a lot of people were struggling with it. And that's another thing I want to talk about later.
Mm-hmm.
So I did single blind testing. It was impossible to do complete double blind testing, but I did single blind testing with folks using very good speakers that have nearly perfect spinorama data. So these are speakers whose on-axis and off-axis responses are basically consistent. The listening window follows all the way out to the early reflections and late reflections response. The power response has that perfect tilt to it, kind of a thing. In other words, they were the kind of speaker I had mentioned earlier is ideal for EQing. So this was a really good speaker. And then I had already manually EQ'd everything below 300 hertz. So there was already some DSP EQ that had taken away all of those modal problems that tend to be most audible. Because I wanted to know, what does Dirac do when you've already addressed the bass, which, as I said, accounts for anywhere from 30 to 50% of our perception of good sound. And it was interesting. Now, I was noticing that it seemed subtle, but I kept hearing differences. And I'm like, well, but I can't blind myself. So let me get some other people in here. And I got our own James Larson in here. And we went through a whole bunch of test tracks. And there was a number of times where he couldn't tell the difference at all. He didn't know what I was doing. And I had to tell him I had made a switch before he realized it. And then he had done the same for me, and I couldn't tell the difference. And I brought in some other people, did the same thing, and there was times where they were like, wow, it sounds better, yeah. And then there's other times where they'd be like, it sounds better, and I didn't do anything. It turned out they were like just expecting it. So what I realized, as I had mentioned earlier, was that even Dirac, which I think is probably one of the better EQ systems on the market, when the speaker is already really good and the bass issues are addressed, the effect is very subtle and in some cases completely inaudible. With Odyssey, I've had a very different experience, which was that I bought it because what had happened originally was I was a Dirac beta tester, but when Dirac first came out, it didn't exist in any hardware. It was a computer program, and that was it. This is Dirac Live. And it was very expensive. So they gave me a free sample to use for a while, and I was able to use it, but I couldn't use it with like home theater stuff, movies. And I really liked it. But I couldn't get that, so I decided, well, Odyssey uses similar technology. I'm sure it's just as good. And I went and I got a receiver that contained Odyssey XT Pro. I had a guy come out that had the XT Pro setup kit, which I think you had an article on back when that came out. You had somebody do that for you as well.
Mm-hmm.
It made the bass better. It was clearly better, but I was able to do an even better job with PEQ on my own and multi-sub. It was routinely making everything worse, and I found myself sitting down and turning it off all the time. I didn't like it. And it took a long time to figure out why. It was introducing some tonal abnormalities, including that 2 kilohertz dip that you talked about. And eventually I just stopped using it. Well, when the new editor was introduced, which was only available on the newer receivers, such as those from Marantz and Denon, I did have an opportunity to test that out. And I did find that it improved things. It's better than it used to be. And the XT32 that's come out seems to be better. But I still wouldn't consider it to be as good as my experience with Dirac so far.
Did you use a flat setting or Odyssey setting?
I was a flat setting for my testing for this and for what I'm talking about before.
Yeah, flat setting is definitely preferred for music. Otherwise, the Odyssey setting tends to roll off the highs too much.
Yeah. So, all right, we can go on though. I just wanted people to understand, like, I'm not like a neophyte with this stuff. I've been doing this for a long time. So I'm going to go back to this idea. Is room correction the hero we need? And I want to say again, room correction can do a lot of good, but it can also do a lot of bad. So when the speakers are good and you want to be in a position where you've got everything set up right and you just want to get the bass smoothed out and any little anomalies in the mids and highs kind of smoothed out, you want to get maybe a better tonal match between all your speakers, it can be a really good savior in that sense. But when you've got speakers that have flaws or there's other problems in the room, it actually can make things a lot worse. Mm-hmm. And that's what I showed in those earlier measurements. It made the speaker worse. It didn't make it better. And so there's other problems though. So Floyd Toole had been pretty against automatic room correction for a long time. And his main issue with it was it distracts from the real problem. Most speakers on the market are not good enough. There's a lot of speakers on the market that just need to be improved. Their spinorama data is, as Toole would say, not pretty. And if you can make a speaker that has pretty spinorama data, it'll sound good. But when it doesn't have pretty spinorama data, it tends to not sound good. And when it doesn't have pretty spinorama data, it tends to essentially throw EQ a curveball that it can't deal with.
So let me ask you a facetious question here. If we had a way of getting spinorama data on all the different speakers out there, all the current models out there, and you could somehow program this into your room correction system, so the room correction system now has spinorama data for your clip speaker or your Martin Logan speaker or your JBL speaker. Would the room EQ system operate better?
Absolutely. So yes, if the EQ system had the actual spinorama data, the raw data that's used to create those graphs, I should say, built into it, it would be able to use that information when it's making corrections in the room. I mean, the way Dirac works, which is unique amongst the common EQ systems on the market, is that it takes enough different measurements and it filters those measurements as it's doing its processing in such a way that it tries to kind of get at that the best it can, but it can't. And so the reality is if you could actually feed that data into the EQ system, it would be able to ensure that it's not making any inappropriate corrections to the response that it measures in room that would then goof up that listening window.
Gotcha. Man,
but
somebody needs to get busy and do that.
Yeah. Now there's another reason why that needs to be done. And not only that, but also adding in the ability to essentially tell the system how big the room is. And that's because we tend to talk about room curves, like the Harman room curve. You can go on. No, this is a good slide. Okay. We tend to talk about the room curves as sort of universal. Like there's one room curve that's correct for everybody, and then you just adjust it to taste beyond that. And that's not really correct. The room curve of a speaker system is actually supposed to essentially follow the natural response that a perfect speaker would take that has a perfectly flat response with a perfectly flat directivity index in an anechoic chamber if you put it in a room. And so what that means is that there's a tilt to it because naturally the high frequencies are going to roll off and the bass is going to essentially accumulate. And as I said, we tend to hear the reflections of the bass in the room, but we don't hear the reflections in the direct sound as much for the mid and high frequencies. So that response shape that you hear about, where there's sort of a tilted response in room, not a flat response, and that's preferable, comes from the fact that that's what a flat speaker does in a room. And you want the EQ to follow that because that's what sounds natural to us. But the problem is how tilted it is completely depends on the size of the room and the dispersion pattern of the speaker. The more narrow the dispersion of the speaker, the more tilted that response needs to be. The wider the dispersion of the speaker, and the less tilted it needs to be. Except for that, how it tilts actually depends a lot too on where we're talking. So we were talking once before at the folks at Harman, and I was kind of sharing this idea that I had that I think the target curves are not universal. And one of the people we were talking to said, well, yeah, it's, at the lower bass range, it kind of is universal. Everybody likes the bass to be more tilted because that tends to be more natural to what we hear in a room. Bass basically builds up in a room, we hear the reflections. At the high frequencies, the roll off is also part of the natural, what we hear. Even in an anechoic chamber, we like the treble to roll off a bit. But there's this messy middle. There's this area between, let's say, 10 kilohertz and 100 hertz where the shape of that completely depends on the dispersion of the speaker and the acoustics of the room. And automatic room EQ systems can't do anything with that. It would be up to you as the end user to be able to adjust that, except for you as the end user would have no idea without spinorama data what's that supposed to be. So that's a real problem.
Would you say that a speaker with a narrow dispersion, like maybe a horn-loaded speaker, would perform better with room EQ, or you can't really give a rule of thumb about that?
Well, speakers that have higher directivity indices, which tend to be waveguide loaded or horn loaded speakers, tend to also have more consistent off-axis responses because it's easier to create that kind of directivity consistency, if you will, with waveguides. But that's not universally true. There's a handful of companies that don't use waveguides that have created speakers that have very wide dispersion, but actually have very consistent responses. And I showed one earlier. It's not made by the original maker anymore, but it is sold by a few other companies.
You talk about Philharmonic.
The Philharmonic,
Yeah.
right? The BMR.
Yep.
That speaker had a very consistent off-axis response, and the developer of that does not believe in waveguides. In fact, he hates waveguides.
Yep.
He jokes that I'm his nemesis.
Yeah, that's a great measuring speaker. You got to give him credit on that.
Yeah, he did a good job. So anyway, yes, you do tend to see that they work better with EQ though because of that.
So the mic inaccuracy below 30 hertz and above 10 kilohertz, is that because you're dealing with mostly these hockey puck mics that don't have a lot of depth to them?
Well, even the USB mics are not that accurate. So that's another problem. I mean, the issue, and I actually did some testing to find, there's another problem too. You for obvious reasons, you have to point the mic at the ceiling.
Yeah.
So for those of you who don't understand what the obvious reason is, it's that if you point the speaker directly forward, then the microphone is going to have a different, a microphone has its own, it's not really omnidirectional basically. And at very high frequencies, the microphones tend to be very directional. And so what that means is that when it measures the center channel, it's going to measure something different than when it measures the left and right speaker. You'd have to point it at each speaker as it takes each measurement in order to do that. So what you do instead is you point it at the ceiling. And that has some other benefits as well. But the one biggest benefit is it means it's always got the same high frequency response for every speaker in the room. But one of the problems is that the microphone rolls off, and there's a compensation for that, usually referred to as like the 90-degree compensation curve. So I did a bunch of testing to find out. I have an unusually good microphone. It's a lab grade microphone that was tested by an independent laboratory and certified. And it came with a file that was the 90-degree compensation curve file. Again, a lab certified one. And this is better than what pretty much anyone else doing this would use. I also had a tested and calibrated Dayton Audio, I think it's the UMM6, the USB plug-in microphone with a 90-degree compensation curve from this lab. And I went and did measurements with Dirac specifically because it was easiest to do the testing. And I don't have the data to show you guys, but I'll tell you my experience so everybody knows this. And the microphone was pointed at the speaker, doing just the left and right speakers, and then pointed up at the ceiling, doing that, using that correction curve. And then I compared it with my lab microphone. And I found what I thought I was going to find, and it was not good. Above 10 kilohertz, Dirac was attempting to correct for inaccuracies in the microphone. The first inaccuracy was a general one that every microphone pointed at the ceiling would have, which was that even with the correction, it still was more rolled off than it really should have been above that 10 kilohertz point. It was not too bad, but as you got higher and higher in frequency, the error got worse and worse. And Dirac was essentially trying to flatten out the response of the speaker. And this was a speaker that had a very extended response. And so at one point, when I went and looked at the transfer function, it was applying about 10 decibels of boost up about 24, 25 kilohertz. That's really high. And that's a lot of boost, and it was unnecessary. So then I did that with the USB microphone to see, and what I found was that the inaccuracies in the microphone itself and the inaccuracies in the correction curve combined to create an even bigger error with Dirac and the high frequencies, and it was adding even more boost. So
I wonder if that happens in a closed loop system when you buy a receiver that has its own microphone that's designed for that system.
Well, so when I was doing this, I was actually testing Dirac for NAD, and I talked to Paul Barton, who had developed their correction curve, about this, and he goes, "Oh, you got to send me that data because we tested it. And we were pretty sure it wasn't doing that." And I showed him everything. I said, it is. Look at what it's doing. And so what I mean, I don't know what came of it on their end. On my end, my conclusion was that you really need to be careful. And what I do now when I set up Dirac is I intentionally manually change the target curve to better follow the natural response of the speaker at the point above 10 kilohertz instead of allowing it to try to flatten that out, because I know that that is as much an error in the microphone as it is a non-flatness, if you will, in the speaker.
Well, the other option you could do, especially now with Odyssey, and I think Dirac does it as well, is you could limit the range or the bandwidth of correction. If you look at Anthem Arc, initially it only used to correct up to 5 kilohertz. Now I think they're actually allowing 20 kilohertz correction, but by default it goes to 5 kilohertz. And there's a lot of merit to doing that because you're below the stochastic region you were talking about before, and now you're also below the microphone error region that you're talking about now.
Yeah, I mean, I think correcting out to 20 kilohertz, you got to be really careful. As I said, the biggest problem is that those target curves are not universal. The best thing would be to try to create a curve that better follows the natural general shape of the response rather than trying to fit something that's what you want it to look like.
The problem is most people don't have that data when they're doing
right. No, they wouldn't have that data. So we can go to the next one is the last one. And this was, I jokingly called this showing off. So I just wanted to show people how good the simulation was relative to the actual measurement. So the measurement in the sort of a brownish looking one that has less bass, that is a measurement that is simulating what the in-room response would look like. But actually, that was created using data from a speaker that was never measured in a room at all. It was measured anechoically. And so I then used my algorithm to create this in-room response. And you can see that it actually follows the shape of the response that I actually measured in-room really well. Now, I probably should have showed this as well, but for those of you who are saying, well, maybe that's because that's what the speaker's measurements look like outside, the outside measurements James shows in the review look nothing like this. Like this is actually, I think you were impressed too. Like it's amazing how close this was. The only area where the errors are bad is in the bass range. And that's only because the algorithm I used I didn't use my room as the room response. So I didn't have the actual bass modes of my room in the simulation.
Yeah, you're not getting all that room gain basically.
Yeah, none of that was included. It was all, but everything above you can see is very, very close.
That's pretty awesome. So there you have it, guys. Let me...
Yeah. Also, I want to make a point. So somebody said that professional calibrated microphones cost $1,000. That would be dirt cheap. My microphone was $1,500, and that one's dirt cheap. They tend to actually be about $3,000 to $50,000, depending on what you're trying to get.
So there's a comment here. I just wanted to see if we want to address it.
So the final point on this chart has been so relentlessly attacked by SonarWorks Engineering that in version 4, the relatively complex measurement procedure that used to take me an hour takes me 20 minutes. I'm not actually sure what he's saying. So
I don't know what that system is either.
It's another EQ system, and it's uses software on a computer, and it's used by a lot of pro audio guys to help improve the response of their monitoring system. It's supposed to be pretty good. I've used it just to test it out. They gave me a sample of it, but I'm not 100% sure what specific point he's talking about.
This is a point from before THX standard narrow dispersion speakers for this very reason. I guess that's for more effective with the room EQ that we were talking about.
Maybe they're very tight-lipped about why they set the standards they set up. But a lot of their speakers, I will say, had pretty wide dispersion, to be honest. A lot of THX spec speakers didn't use waveguides. Some did, like Klipsch, but that's Klipsch. That's like their thing.
So one thing I would like to talk about with practical aspects of room correction that I've noticed is systems like Odyssey, YPOW, the Pioneer system. I had never tested DRAC in my own room. I've noticed that when you put a speaker on the wall, the room correction systems really mess it up. They assign them as large speakers. None of them account for boundary gain, and I don't understand why none of the systems have done that yet. It's like you should have a feature that says, are you putting the speaker on the floor or are you putting it up against the wall? Because that makes a really big difference in how it's interpreting the bass management for that speaker and also how it's doing the EQ for that speaker.
Yeah, they tend to base it on the -3 dB point that it calculates for it, which, you know, if you actually look at the measured response of those speakers, it's pretty hard to even figure out what that accurately would be, because the responses are usually so not flat in the bass, but it ends up coming up with something that often is way too low. I mean, there's another problem. You can make a speaker that can go all the way down to 20 hertz, but can't do more than, 40 decibels worth of that. And so the system doesn't know that. Many of these systems don't include anything to measure distortion. And so there's usually nothing in the EQ system to essentially account for the dynamic range of the speaker itself. And that's another thing.
Yeah, that's a big problem, because some of these EQ systems don't stop at +3 dB or +4 dB.
Oh, they apply a lot.
They boost 6 to 10 dB. So if you don't have the headroom in your system, you're now limiting. You could be clipping your amplifiers. It could be overexerting your woofers.
Yeah, there was actually a test that was done in a group I used to work with that they had done a bunch of comparison of speakers. They were using DIRAC as part of the comparison process, so they would test with and without. And specifically with a JBL speaker, I don't know exactly why. It may have been a problem with that speaker or just something about the way DIRAC was interacting with that speaker, but it was causing the speaker to distort really badly when DIRAC was activated. And the primary cause was it was providing too much boost in the bass. But why, I don't know. They couldn't get it. They couldn't fix it. They ended up having to just not use DIRAC with it and note it as a problem.
So somebody's asking here, should I set it even small if Odyssey says large and let my sub handle it? 90% of the times, all of your speakers should be set small.
Yeah.
Unless you're like me or Matt that have giant trophy speakers with multiple subwoofer drivers built in, you don't have large speakers, especially your surround speakers. Let your multi-sub handle the bass. Your system's going to thank you for it. You're going to have better, evenly distributed bass. You're going to have more dynamic range, and it's just going to be more consistent from seat to seat.
Especially true when you're using a receiver to power your main speakers. Even if you have relatively big full-range main speakers, the reality is, with the exception of Klipsch or brands like JTR, most speakers aren't very efficient. And so you've got a receiver that's putting out probably about 100 watts, and you're trying to feed that to a pair of full range speakers plus all the rest of them. You're just better off high passing those so that you can free up a little bit of that power basically and provide more of it to improve dynamic range. So there's other reasons to do it.
So let's give some bottom line about this discussion. At least my takeaway from this discussion is room correction's not evil. So
no, it's not evil.
We're not taking that viewpoint if anybody misinterprets what we've been talking about for the last hour. But you have to be very careful with how you apply room correction, especially if you're doing full bandwidth room correction. Room correction does not make a bad speaker good, but it could make a good speaker bad.
Yes, it can make a relatively okay speaker, like a good enough speaker. We thought that those Martin Logan sounded fine. They're not perfect. They've got some minor issues, but they really weren't bad. But the EQ, actually, I didn't mention what it sounded like. It sounded worse too. Yeah. I didn't think it sounded good. And so it can take a speaker that's okay and make it pretty bad. It can take a speaker that's really good, and if you set it up wrong, like you just don't know what you're doing and you get the measurements wrong, it can definitely make it worse. We've seen that before. And so the problem is you just got to be careful. And the bigger thing I wanted to point out was just because the measurement looks ruler flat doesn't mean it is. That measurement doesn't reflect what you hear. And that's a really common problem, is that people don't realize that what they're measuring isn't really what they're hearing.
Yeah. The other takeaway I would say too is use your auto setup at the very minimum. Use your auto setup to do your digital delay compensation for your speakers. It's usually really good at doing that, especially if you have any type of DSP processing going to a sub or something. It could get the distance for that sub more accurate than you're going to get it unless you have a mic and able to measure it. So use it for that. Use it for your levels. Most cases, if you have the ability to limit the room correction bandwidth, I would suggest that you limit it to 5 kilohertz or maybe even 500 hertz and just focus on using the room EQ for bass. If you're sophisticated enough and you have a PEQ function built into your receiver or your processor and you have REW and a microphone, manual EQ works really well if you've got multi-sub and you have the subs properly positioned so that the EQ works over a wide area and not just one seat.
Yeah, and I would add, this is the biggest point I wanted to make. You should look at things like Odyssey and Dirac as frosting on the cake, but it's not a replacement for the cake. And what I mean by that is that in a really good, well set up system, it can make things that much better. But you've got to have a really good, well set up system, meaning don't chintz out on speakers and then expect Dirac to fix it for you or expect Odyssey to fix it for you. It's not going to happen. And don't chintz on the setup. Don't be like, well, I'll just throw it up in the most convenient places so it looks nice, and then Dirac will make it all sound good. Or again, Odyssey will make it sound good, because that also isn't going to happen. You've got to put in the work to get everything. You've got to buy the right equipment, and you've got to set it up correctly, and then you can apply your EQ, and it can make things a little better for you.
Yeah. All right, guys. So I'd like to see your comments below. Do you guys use room EQ? Which room EQ do you like? Do you find that it actually improves the sound of your system, or are you limiting it to just the bass frequencies? Give us some feedback down below. Let us know if you like these discussions, if you want us to continue these kind of topics. I was kind of talking to Matt about potentially doing a room correction EQ comparison of all the major brands out there. It's a pretty big project, but depending on the views of this video, we might do it or we might not do it. So Matt, thanks again for joining this discussion. Thanks for all your work you put into this slide presentation. I'm going to be putting this on our Patreon channel. If anybody wants access to it, to look at all the bullet points and stuff like that, please join our Patreon at patreon.com/audioholics. And until next time, my friends, keep listening